Okay, and now time is now 3 minutes past the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. A few housekeeping notes before we go any further. I just want to let people know that this is a live training, so I am really here. I'm not a machine. If you have any questions throughout the duration of this training, feel free to hit me up in the Q&A panel. You'll notice in the WebEx view, you'll see there's kind of two ways of communicating. There's chat and then there's Q&A. I tend to monitor the Q&A as a practice because then I can mark off the ones that I've answered via the chat window. So if you could answer any of your questions in there, that would be great. I do not monitor the chat that often. The reason that you would want to communicate that way is that everyone is muted by default, because sometimes people accidentally unmute themselves and aren't paying attention. Sometimes we just get a lot of haptic feedback. So everybody's been muted just to prevent any disturbances. And if you ask questions, I'll try to address them right there, or I'll stop periodically to make sure that they are getting answered. Or if it's a really big question that's kind of outside the scope of what we're presenting at that point, I'll likely push it to the end. So here we are at the part 2 of core certification prep. If you haven't viewed part 1, I recommend that you go back and do that. You certainly can be a part of that training. You can be a part of this training today, but I also recommend that you go back and review that one because that's going to cover a lot of situations throughout the certification exam. Before I go any further in the presentation, I will show you a few resources that you do have at your disposal. So I'm going to go to certification.alteryx.com, which really just takes you to the community. And you'll see here that not only do we have the exams, but we also have prep guides for core and advanced. So if you're looking for that core, go ahead and click into that prep guide. There'll be an overview of what that path to success looks like, the exam format, the outline of what we're going in. So in the first training, we largely covered this in and out piece with a few pieces covering this preparation, which really related to data types. But today we're going to be covering join and a little bit of transform, and then we have a few self-assessment tools. So if outside of this training today, you can kind of mark down your confidence, and based on your confidence, you can kind of mark yourself in this thermometer of how prepared you are. So if you can score yourself really high, then I think you're really ready to take the certification exam. If not, then a little bit lower. But do know that we don't monitor this. This is your own self-assessment. So really being honest with yourself will be your best way to get past this certification exam. Beyond this training here today, or this 4-part series, we also have this curriculum. So if you want to go a level deeper beyond what we discuss here today around blending data, feel free to check out this section. You can see our interactive lessons, our documents, and we also have some weekly challenges that might help you get kind of practicing some of these blending techniques along the way. So those are some of the resources that you have available. The other thing that I'm going to point out is if I go back to live training here, you'll see that I have a whole history of trainings, and each one of these has a video playback of what happened there. So if there's one particular concept you want to follow up on or you missed, go ahead and view those. We have over 80 hours of training there ready and available for you at your needs. So a lot of exciting stuff that's there, and all the resources are there that need to help you to pass. It's just a matter of spending the time doing it. So let's get back to the topic we're talking about today, and that's core certification prep part 2. First, we're going to address some of the upcoming trainings just so you know when part 3 and so on is coming down the line. Then we're actually going to jump into some workflow background so we can understand some of the behavior of what we're talking about today, and then actually see it in action through our designer training. The one thing I will note is that the workflow for this training is attached to that core certification prep post. So if I were to click back into core certification, you'll see that there's a post here, Cert Prep Part 2. If you want to see what I'm building today, you can download that and simply follow along. Okay, so October is going through really fast. This month is screaming by. We only have one more training left, and it may seem scary, that little Halloween joke, but we do have an Introduction to Regular Expressions class running on 10:30 on the eve of Halloween. make those scary strings a little bit easier to work with and work with those regular expressions. So this assumes no knowledge of working with regular expressions. So if you haven't done it before, go ahead and join that training. And even if you don't get at the end of that training what regular expressions or really how to write complex regular expressions, at least you'll know the absolute power of what you can do with them. In November, we're going to resume into the core certification prep course. We're going to be running part 3 on that first week of November. We're going to do a beginner course around Alteryx for Excel users. So if you'd like to contextualize your knowledge of how to use Alteryx from an Excel background, like here's how you do a pivot table, go ahead and join that training. And then finally, on that week of 11/20, part 4 of the core certification prep will be run then. And do note, the last week of November, since it is a U.S. holiday of Thanksgiving, we will not be running a training session that week. So background for today's training, use case. An organization needs to combine the separate data sources. And really what we need is to use the join palette to bring together a variety of data sources in a variety of different ways. So when you blend something, you can blend via different behaviors. And there's really 3 main tools that are used to accomplish that. And we're going to introduce them here to you today. So really, it's not going to be that difficult of a training today, right? Really, we're going to be teaching 3 tools, but really understanding these deeply will really help you on certification day and working with your prep and blend. You'll see inside of our core certification exam, sometimes we don't test a question on just a tool, but a series of tools. And so we'll say, which one of these 4 workflows accomplish this task? And for a lot of them, it requires you to kind of visualize what's happening inside each of these tools, right? You say, oh, a select, it must be doing this, and then there's a join after that, so they must be bringing these rows together this way, and this is the expected output. So there's some questions on there that are tough because you kind of have to visualize what your output will be, but the more you know about these tools, the better off you're going to be. So these are the 3 tools that we're going to do: simply a join, a union, and append, okay? And what we're going to cover today is kind of 2 use cases, one around customer transactions data, and the other just kind of unioning together 3 different San Francisco data sets. So we'll be talking about that today. So let's go ahead and get started with our first tool. So the join tool, possibly the most commonly used tool in the blending palette. I won't say in Alteryx Gather and Alteryx Designer, but in the whole tool palette. First of all, I think it's important, if you don't come from a data background, to understand why do we even have to blend? Why don't organizations put everything into one giant data set? There's a concept, well, there's a few different reasons. The first of which is that they have many source systems that are disparate. They don't know, they're just collecting information, but they haven't really thought through how that information combines together into one picture view. So that's usually what's happening. But for other organizations that do have somewhat of a structured data strategy, what you see a lot of times is that they do something called normalization, which basically means that they've split up the data into multiple files or tables to kind of conserve on computing. So what do I mean by that? So let's say I had 1 million customers, okay, and they all lived in the state of Ohio. What I could do is either create one table that has 1 million customers, and for each customer have information about where they live in Ohio, but realistically it's going to have the value Ohio 1 million times, and probably about 75 zip codes, right? But they'll redundantly be happening over and over again. That's going to be called kind of the denormalized view, where everything is kind of combined into one big view. But what organizations do to kind of save on compute space is they'll actually split a lot of that information into 2 different places. They'll say, here's my customers, 1 million, but I'm going to create another table that's just state information or address information, right? So it might just say, they might have a table just dedicated to zip code. So they'll have whatever 75 rows representing the 75 zip codes in Ohio and really one Ohio field, right? So you can see instead of doing that 1 million times, they've reduced that 1 million Ohio records down to 75. So Purposely, many times, they split it out into different tables to save on that compute space. But really, when it comes to you're usually trying to find the answer. So sometimes you have to reconstruct the way they've kind of broken things out. So that's how we arrive at the problem of having different data sets that we need to blend together. So let's see what happens in the join tool. Okay, the join tool, in layman's terms, simply combines data together in a horizontal fashion based on some common denominator. Okay, so in this case, I have two data sets, and arbitrarily I've labeled them left and right. Okay, in this case, it doesn't matter left and right depending on what your outcome is desired, but in this case, let's just say I have two. And oddly enough, my organization, not that many would do it this way, just simply for the sake of this example, they split it into two data sets, one with my first name and one with my last names, right? And I want to bring it together to find somebody's full name. So in one table I have John, Tim, and Jane, 12, with an ID of 12, 33, and 36. And on the right, I have 2, 12, and 36, Smith, Deer, and Doe. Okay? And simply all the join tool does is I can combine these two data sets on some common field. Certainly, there's no way to combine first and last name together because John does not match any particular last name. But you see my organization was nice enough to leave behind some sort of ID to tie these together. So I can say the ID of John 12 and the left input also is Deer with an ID of 12 on the second data set. And that's exactly what our join tool is going to do for us. It's just going to find where those two names, those two IDs are alike. So what it's first going to do is combine the names of these two data sets together. So first, I have ID first, and then on the right input, I have ID last. Now, since there's really two ID fields, what Alteryx will do is it's going to rename the second one because there can't be identical field names. So it's just going to add a prefix, right ID. So that's how the schema gets formed on that join output. Now what it's going to do is it's simply going to scan through the records and find where ID is equal to ID. So it'll start off in that left input, find the ID of 12, look in the right input, and it'll find 12. So there you go. 12 and 12 match. You also find that record ID 36 match. However, you'll see that there are some items that didn't match. So in the left input, I have an ID of 33 with Tim, and on the bottom, I have an ID of 2 with Smith. Those two don't really match between the two data sets, which is why I want to introduce kind of the second and third outputs of these data sets. The first of which is going to be that left output. The left output is simply saying, what was in my left input that was not in my right? So in this case, Tim, ID number 33 was not found in my right data set. Conversely, on the flip side, you'll see that Smith had no match to my left input. I'm going to pause for a second. It looks like we are having some audio issues. Okay, let me do one thing. I'm going to cut my audio here, and I'll be back in 1 second to make sure that it is fresh and everybody can hear me okay. Please hold for a second. Okay, I'm now reconnected. Can someone type into the Q&A if this is any better? Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. So at either rate, this is the final output of your whole data set, right? I get really 3 outputs. Now, there may be times where I have no output from the left and right. That meant that my 2 data sets had a perfect join between the 2. So that's really what's going to happen there. What I love about Alteryx versus something like SQL is that in SQL, you usually just get to find the output that you're looking for, but the left and right output do signify some importance. So for some reason, if you're joining on somebody's name between 2 data sets, you can look at the difference between them and say, hey, should these be matching up? Why might they not be? Maybe there's white space in one data set that's on the end of those first names, right? So it allows you to kind of view what's happening and why things aren't matching and if they should or should not. The other thing that I'm going to make mention of is that the join tool is case sensitive, right? So if I was joining on names again, and in one data set, my name was all caps John, and in the other data set, it was all lowercase John, they would not join together. What you could do in that case is you could use a formula tool to simply uppercase them or lowercase them and then blend them together. But it is case sensitive, so if you're experiencing join issues, that is something that is happening. So we're going to be building this workflow in a second here, but I really want to show this. I really want to show this example because there's a lot of information that we can take just outside of that join output. And I tell people this all the time, is sometimes people are solely focused on the idea of getting to one result, right? What joined between the 2? I want to see how much my customer spent. But really there's a lot of interesting analysis that could go on for things that didn't match, right? So let's look at my 2 data sets. I have one called customer transactions, aka what are my customers spending? And then I have a kind of a customer file along the way, and there's some information around whether they responded to a campaign. In this case, we're ignoring if they responded. We're just looking at, it's essentially a customer list to us, right? So this left output, what it really says is, here's some transactions, but I can't attach any customers to them. Well, that sounds like a data issue, right? Maybe I should tell my grocery store, let's say this is a grocery store, right, to do a better job tracking those customers. So they could be purchasing their groceries anonymously, for example. So for a lot of us, we have loyalty cards when we go to the grocery store to get that 10 cents off that loaf of bread, for example. That is something that allows them to scan my ID and see what I'm buying. But what they may be doing is having a bad, our cashiers may be doing a poor job of scanning those cards and collecting people's user information that we can tie it back to who that customer is and what they're doing. On the flip side, in this customer respond full list, right, I have a list of customers that aren't buying things coming out this right output. Why aren't they buying things? Are they too far away from the store? Are they not responding to my campaigns? There's a whole set of analysis that can work there. So for many people, they think the sole thing that they can do is just see how much my customers spent by blending them together. But really, there's a lot of information that you could split out a lot of different directions. So I tend to approach a lot of these join tools to tell people, hey, it's more than just a join output. It's seeing what's not there, what the problems are, and that's really valuable. So what does that join tool look like in action? Well, do you remember how I joined an ID? When you open a join tool, this is where you're going to put that selection. You're going to join by specific fields. And there could be more than one, right? It could be 3 fields that should be equal to each other in order for them to join. In this case, we just have one between my 2 data sets. Customer ID should be equal to customer ID. Now, down below here, you have a set of Venn diagrams. These Venn diagrams are not selectable. They're simply just images showing you what the output of this join tool will be. It is merely a reference visualization. So we have those 3 outputs, L, J, R. It's going to show you that this is really the data that you're getting back. Okay, and then down below, we have a series of selections. So if you've worked with that select tool, that's all it is that's embedded inside of here. Typically, we see a lot of this. If I'm blending on customer ID and customer ID, we get that duplication because it's in both data sets. A lot of times you'll see people just deselect one of those customer IDs. But additionally, you can change the data types and the size. On that note, I will say one important thing. In order for two things to join together inside the Alteryx Designer, they also must be the same data type. Okay, so this is why it was really important to cover that in prep part 1. But I need to make sure that my numbers are joining to numbers or my strings are joining to strings, but numbers will not join to strings. So I need to make sure to change those. And I know a lot of people, when they're working with that, they say, oh, I'll just change it here and I'll be good to go. That's not the case. What this does is it simply changes the data after it joins together, right, through the select. What you need to do is go upstream and drop the select tool in to demonstrate or to actually change that data type before it gets to that join tool. And we will demo that through our presentation here today. So the next tool that we're going to be covering is unions. So in the join tool, we saw things join side by side and horizontally. We were increasing the width of information across a row. Union is different, and a lot of people get them mixed up, but they're very completely different behaviors. Unions simply add rows. It adds depth to your data set. You're not adding information to a row, you're just adding more rows. Okay, so simply I have two data sets here, 2011 customers and 2012 customers. And really, I don't want two data sets, I just want one with all customers from 2011 and 2012. That's a job for my union tool. Now inside the union tool, there's a couple of different configurations, and the default one is the automatic configuration. And we'll demonstrate this inside of our workflow, but I'll just call this out now, is that automatic configuration. So with the union tool, I can connect as many data sets as I want on the input. And in this case, I'm connecting 2011 first. Whatever I connect first into that union tool, and I believe this is a question on the certification exam, whatever I connect first is going to be the go-ahead schema of my output data set, right? So even though I have ID name and ID full name, which headers is it going to choose on the output? It's going to choose whatever input came in first or you connected first. So the outcoming result is going to be ID and name. Now, what it's going to do is simply bring in all of that data from that data set. And from our second connection, it's going to go ahead and try to map in my data. In that automatic configuration setting, it tries to map it based on name similarity, right? So it says, oh, hey, I see there's a column named ID in that first data set. There's a column ID in this one. They'll match nicely, so I'll just line that column up with that one. However, name and full name do not match. So it's going to create a completely new column called full name, okay? And this is probably not the behavior that you want. You probably want full name to align with name, even though they're a little different. And there's something that we can do that. We can first use a select tool to change the name, or if I flipped over to manual configuration, you can manually align these items together, and my finalized data set will appear as this. So notice I have no more information added to my rows, but rather I just added a huge depth to my data set. So I've created one large database, and this is really a great way of working with your data, is you can bring it in all at once and work with it in bulk. So working with that union tool, here's a quick view of that manually configure field. So you can see here's my first connection. Here's what it's going to be named on output. You can see I have that issue of first name, last name not matching first and last. You will see that date of birth did line up. If I wanted to realign these, I could simply click and highlight on first and use these arrows to justify where it should be. So I would probably highlight this and click it 3 times to get it aligned with first name and then last name over here as well. In addition, if I wanted, let's say I had, even though I brought 2011 in first and then 2012 in second, if I wanted that 2012 data to be at the top of my data set, I could just click on select specific order and realign those input data to say which way they should order from top to bottom. Okay, finally, the Append tool.
This append tool is probably the simplest tool to understand, which is exactly why it also makes it one of the most, I'll say dangerous, but it's not inherently dangerous. It'll just run a really long time if you execute this incorrectly, okay? So it's important to understand the behavior of using this append tool before you just go in and play around with it. Simply enough, the append tool takes two data sets and joins them together. Except, remember in that join tool how I said there's two conditions in which you can connect them together, aka ID? The append tool has none of that. It has no way to tie records to one another. So what it's going to do is simply say, give each of these data sets kind of a multiplier of each other, right? If there's no way to join these, it's going to say literally, I don't know what to put these records to, so I'm going to give this record to everything, right? So what the rule of thumb is if I have 3 records in one data source and 1 in another, it's really going to be the multiplier of the 2. If I have 3 in 1, my output data set will be 3. If I have 3 and 3, it's going to be 9. If I have 5 and 5, it's going to be 25, 10 and 10, 100. So you can imagine how dangerous it gets when you go to 1,000,000 records by 1,000,000 records, right? And that can run a really long time. So why would I use it? It's just a simple way of adding some data globally to one another. So it's a good way of saying, hey, I want to find every combination of, or I just want to quickly append one little bit of information into my records. In this case, I have kind of a list of locations of stores that I have with a supply request, and I have one warehouse that can kind of serve or supply those supply requests, right? It's in Atlanta. And I simply want to do some sort of subtraction of 900 from each of these store locations. What I would do is connect those store locations into my append tool, and you'll see it's like the join tool where I build width to my data, and I'm going to put that record of Atlanta on every single row of data, right? So it's literally found every combination, and as promised, I told you it was going to be 3 times 1, and that's the result. But now I can do 900 minus 150 to create a new warehouse inventory number. Let's add a little bit of complexity here and say I've got 2 warehouse locations now, right? Atlanta and Toledo. What's going to happen now that I have 2? Well, as promised, I'm going to have 6 records as an outcome because there's 3 in one and 2 in another. But you'll see that New York has to have 2 warehouses that it could use to bring data in. So you'll see that it'll duplicate New York to accommodate Atlanta and Toledo. It'll do the same thing for San Mateo, and then also for Denver. So you can see that it's created what some people coming from a SQL background will call a cross join or a Cartesian join. That's really what's going to be going on here. There is one safety mechanism that will prevent you from doing 1,000,000 by 1,000,000 right off the bat, and I'll point that out once we get into the designer. The configuration couldn't be easier. You really don't have to click anything. You'll see that there is an embedded select, so I could change how I want that data or what data I want to come out of that tool. But aside from that, like I said, you don't even have to specify join criteria. So let's go ahead and build some of these inside of our Alteryx designer. So go ahead and open your Alteryx designer, or simply just watch along with me. And do note that this session is being recorded, so if I do move quickly, feel free to come back and rewatch and follow along. So first of all, I'm going to go ahead and connect to my customer transactions file. So let me drag in an input data tool, go to file, and let's go ahead and dig this out. Sorry, it's pretty deep in here. All right, customer transactions. Okay, and this is a CSV. And the other thing that I am going to show you is that I didn't necessarily have to use an input data tool. The other option that you do have, is that I could have just gone to my data set, and I'm actually going to bring in my customer responder pool data set this way. I could just drag and drop it into the canvas, and that's a quick way of configuring it. So I've got my 2 data sets. Let's quickly review what's there. First, I have my customer transactions file. I see some sort of ID, what the order priority was there a discount, order price, shipping cost, where it came from, an order ID, what the profit was. really a lot of information on the sale itself, but not on the customer. So how do I get that customer information, right? How can I tell, in this case, we just want to answer the question, how much are my customers spending? And I'll even take it a step further and say, beyond what are my customers spending, but how much are they spending in each sales segment? So you can see that I've got product categories like office, supplies, technology, furniture, right? What percent do these account for my total business? So that's another question that we're going to be asking ourselves along the way. What is going to be that customer segment? Okay. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of do something that I see a lot of people do right off the bat, is they'll just bring a join in and just go ID, ID. You'll see there's a customer ID here. And in this case, it will work nicely, right? But I'm just going to simulate a situation where it usually doesn't. Okay, and you don't have to follow along with this. I'll just show you something people do make. They'll usually run into something like this, right? And they'll get this error saying there's issue blending, and you'll read the issue, and do note that these errors usually are pretty telling on what's going on here. String field can only be joined to other string fields. Well, if I inspect my data, I'll go to my metadata here, and go to customer ID, I can see it's in64, a number here, and I'll go to my view over here and see it's vString, right? So it's a string trying to join to a number. It's not going to work. Okay. Well, fine. What I'll have to do is make sure that those two data types are set nicely to each other. So I'm just going to flip that customer ID back to vString, and they'll blend and play together nicely. Okay. Or I'll just omit that select altogether. However, I am going to keep that select in there because I am going to be doing some calculation on sales. So I'm going to crack that open, go down to sales, and I'm just going to make that a double to make sure that I can do some form of calculation on them. So let's go ahead and run it again. And one thing that I like to do is, first of all, I like to add a browse. And if you want to know a really good shortcut, Control-Shift-B will add a browse to all outputs. And I'm going to run my workflow again. Now, you'll notice inside my workflow that I get these little cards that disappear in a few seconds. I recommend to a lot of people to change that setting and make sure that it persists. And if you want to do that, click on the white space of your canvas and go to this connection progress and just say show. Okay, so now once you actually click into your canvas, it will show as long as you've done it. And this is a really great way of just seeing a high-level view of what's happening with your data. So you can see I have about 9,500 customer transactions and 2,600 customers, but 83 of those transactions don't have customer information attached to them, right? So that might be some sort of blending or data issue. On the flip side, you can see out of my right output, all of my customers have some sort of transaction. So that's a really good feedback. And between the two data sets of about 9426, 900 and 9300 roughly found some sort of customer information. So if I panned over here, you can see all my customer information. If I keep scrolling, you can see my data set is now much wider, where I've got first name, address, a lot of more information on those customers. Now let's go and look at this join tool a little closer and observe a few things. The first of which is that you can see everything that's happening inside of what's going to come out. Now, since I'm doing customer on customer ID, you'll see that's a little bit redundant for my data set. So if I scrolled through this data set and looked at ID 22241, and I went to customer ID, should go customer ID, sorry, of 10, and I went to my other customer ID, it would be 10. And of course they're going to be the same, because in this join output, they said they had to be the same in order to join. So sometimes it's really redundant to have that column in there twice on a join output. So you could deselect this right here, and that would work fine. If they are named similarly, do you remember how I showed you it would say right customer ID In this case, it didn't duplicate it because one has an underscore and one doesn't. But if I went into options, I could actually deselect duplicate fields, which is really nice for kind of deduping what's there. In the exam, and the course certification exam, pay close attention to these option menus because there's a lot of information there that people don't know, and the exam points people here purposely. So do this for the select tool and the join tool, and just play around with them, right? You could do something as simple as sort on field name ascending, right? Now all my field names are sorted nicely, so if I was looking for that one field name, it's much quicker to find it, okay? So there's a lot of great things. I could revert that to the incoming order originally, and we're back to where we began. So now that I've joined my data together, let's ask ourselves a few questions, right? I know what my customers are buying. Let's just see how much each segment is making, right? So I'm going to create an aggregation, a summarize tool. Many of you may be familiar with this. That says, what are my sales for each customer segment? So let's go ahead and find said customer segment. Here it is. It will be in the second data set for that customer info, and I'm going to group by that. Group by simply means find the unique values, and I believe there's 4 distinct customer segments that people could be categorized into. So as a result of this group by, I would expect only 4 records as a result. But what I want to do for each of these 4 segments is I want to sum up all of the sales that happened in that time period. So I'm going to go to my sales, which is nicely the type of double from my select earlier on, and add that as a sum. Let's do a quick run and inspect our data. Down below, you'll see that I do have this nice consumer, corporate, home office business 4 distinct views. My sum of sales looks nice. It's actually added everything up for all of those customers. So now I can see each of my segments. But I also want to see what percent of this is that of my total sales, right? What is that? Well, really, what I need to do is in some parallel stream, calculate the total sales and append that into my records to make that calculation work, okay? And if that didn't make sense, just watch and you'll start to understand why I did this. So I'm going to bring in a separate summarize tool and simply just do the sum of sales. So I'm add sum, and I'll just call this total sales. Since I didn't group by anything, it literally gives me 1 record back, the total for the whole data set. Now we know that the percent of the whole is going to be whatever for consumer, it's going to be this number divided by this number, right? But I need to get them into a position where they'll be divisible by each other, right? AKA, I need to have this total sales available on each and every record in my data set to calculate that total. So what I'm going to do is I'm finally going to use that append tool, because remember, I don't really have a join logic here. I don't have an IDE. I literally want that total sales to land on every record. So I'll drag in the append tool, no configuration needed, and run it. So now that one value has been appended to each of my sales in that data set. So now for the final step, I just want to answer a quick question. I want to say this divided by this divided by this, and so on and so forth. And to do that, we're going to use a simple formula tool, and let's create the field called %. So I'm going to select a column, say add column called %. I'm going to ask for my sum of sales divided by my total sales. I'm going to multiply that by 100 so it looks like a nice whole number. So now I've got a nice view of my percentage, 20, 37, 23, 18. I've quickly and efficiently built these up through a blend and an append. So I'm going to pause there for a second because I know that really went quickly, and see if there are any questions along the way. Okay, so I'm going to do one more thing, and bear with me here for a second, just to demonstrate one more behavior of this append tool. I'm going to do something really silly and somewhat nonsensical. I'm going to go to those customer segments again and append this list of numbers that I just built called field 1. It's just the numbers 1 through 15, and run that very quickly. You'll see that each consumer got those cells 1 through 15, right? So it does exactly what we expect. It literally gave every value to every other value between the two data sets. But I'm going to go ahead and just type in one more value here, the value of 16. Actually, let me go one more, 17. And you'll see I get an error. Let's see what happened. And I do believe this is a question. You'll see at the bottom down here, there's an option that says warn an error on too many records being generated, okay? And it says errors on appends more than 16 records, okay? For these two inputs, T and S, what do these T and S mean? For the most part, it doesn't really matter for the append tool. The general recommendation and the rule of thumb that we go to is saying the larger data set, the one that has the most records, should go into the T, and the smaller one should go into the S. So you see in the last one I put 4 into the top and 1 into the bottom. But really what it does is this S just detects how many records are about to get appended to T, right? In this case, there were 17 records, and it sensed there are more than 16, and it says at the source input, hey, stop, don't run this because you're about to make a very large data set, right? Which you might want to do, but it's a little bit of a safety warning before you actually commit to it. If I wanted to turn that off, I could just go down here, click on that, and say allow all appends, and everything will be as normal. So that's exactly what that little option is going on down there. Okay, let's go do one more blending tool, and then we'll wrap it up here. So I'm going to go back to my File Explorer and grab some data sets. So I'm going to grab these 3 San Francisco data sets and drag them into my canvas and just take a quick peek at them. Okay, so I'll just order these so they make sense, 2011, 2012, and 2013, and I've got 3 different files, and I just want to create one large data set containing all of my data from San Francisco, 2011, 2012, and 2013. So really I just want to add depth. That sounds like a job for the union tool, okay? You can see here I've got employee name, job title information, employee name, job title information, employee name, job title. Oh, that's going to be problematic, right? Because look at that. There's a little bit of a title case difference. There's underscores between names. I'm not sure how these will play nicely together. Objectively, you know, we understand them the same, but our computers aren't so smart sometimes. So sometimes we need to make sure that we lead them to that conclusion. So I'm going to drag in a union tool, and let's just see how these are going to play together. You will note that there is this odd-looking input, which really just means you can drag in as many data sets as you want. I'll just drag them in all in order, 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to toggle over to my union view. By default, it's going to auto-configure by name. So let's go ahead and see how that runs. You'll see that upon running, that I'm going to get a bunch of warnings. And I'm just going to say, hey, agency wasn't present in all inputs, or base pay. It's just saying, hey, there's a little bit of a discrepancy between your data sets. You might want to check those out. The best way to check those out is by going back to the union and click Manually Configure. So you can see my first two data sets are aligning nicely. My second data set is just not playing nicely, right? You can see that all this data is not aligning just because of those underscores. It sees them as different names. What I could do is just simply click on one of those values and use this arrow to realign them. So now employee name will line up nicely with employee name. Well, if you found that kind of tedious, what you can do is highlight a whole group and move them over as a group. Okay? So now I have job title, base pay, overtime pay, total pay, benefits, jurisdiction, year, notes. Let me move those year notes over. Jurisdiction, just so you know, should line up with agency. They mean the same thing inside of our data. And I'll run them again. Now you'll see I get no warnings and all of my data is playing nicely. Okay. I just remembered that I forgot to show you what that data would look like on that automatic configure. So let me just show you that really quickly to show how things are different in that auto configure view. So this was the first mistake we made. Note that there's 20 fields. Okay. And I'm going to scroll through them and you can see, oh, hey, what's happening here? I have another field, employee name, that should have been over here, right? They're not aligning. And this is a very typical behavior. If you see this inside of a union, usually something's not playing right. Now you'll see once I had manually configured it, if I scrolled all the way right, I don't have that problem, right? Everything has aligned nicely. Now I'm sure the next question is, well, hey, what if I wanted it to take that file, San Francisco 2013, right? It had all these underscores. What if I wanted it to have that view, right? What if I wanted it to be all named like this on the output instead of with spaces? I'm going to bring in another union tool to demonstrate. And in order to inherit those names, I'm going to use that file first, right? That first connection here, 1, and make sure that connects in, and then follow 2 and 3. So now when I go to manually configure, you can see that the one with underscores is at the top, but now these two are out of line again. I'm going to show you a third option that's going to be really helpful, and it's going to be called auto config by position. All this simply does is says, hey, ignore the names. I know they're right. What I want is column 1 to match with column 1 in all data sets, and column 2 to column 2. I know positionally they're the same. If you wanted to test that behavior within that manually configure, I could set by position. Now I can see all my employee names, my employee names line up, all the positions seem right. This could be a good way of just getting a starting look, and then you could play around with that. What do they look like by name again? What do they look like by position? So on and so forth. So if I wanted to, now that I've confirmed that they run by position, I could either leave it like this, or I could just say auto config by position, knowing that they line up by position okay. And you'll see that my data sets, again, also line up nicely. The only difference is now that they do have that underscore for the name. But Joe, what about this whole year issue, right? Like, even though I wanted to take the 2013 file, new headers, I wanted 2011 at top, and then 2012, and then 2013. Well, I could go back to this configuration and set a specific output order. So you can see that I named these connections 1, 2, and 3, or by default they're named 1, 2, and 3. You can actually rename these connections so they make more sense, okay? So I'll do this just for demonstration. I just want you to watch. I'm going to name this connection 1 2013. I'll name this one 2012. And I'll name this one 2011. And when you're working with lots of unions, this is a really great way of keeping track of what's happening in your data. So now you can see I have 2011, 2012, 2013. And even if I was working with this in the manually configure view, you could see which output I was working with at that time and which one's causing me issues. So I'm going to say I want 2011 at top, and then 2012, and then 2013. I'll give that another run. And now you can see all my 2011 data at that top, and if I'm not browsing my complete data set here, 2011 is at the top, and if I scroll all the way down, it goes down to 2013. Okay? So there's a lot of things going on in that union. The other thing that's actually kind of fun is in this auto config by name view, you could actually output a common subset of fields, right? So if all these data sets had first name and last name in columns, you're just trying to create a whole list of first name and last name, but you didn't care about all the fields, you could just output a common subset of fields, right? So it will just sense what fields are the same and drop all the other fields where they differed between data sets. And I do believe this is tested. So I will make note here today, right, after this training, is that I've introduced you to a lot in the blending tools. But the way to get really good at them is by clicking on all the things. And I know that sounds funny, but really discovering what this is capable of, tweaking them just little ways and seeing how they behave is really going to be your best bet, because when it comes down to the exam day, we test a lot of those tweaks. Purposely for this exam, we designed it in a way to push people into boundaries of the designer that they've never experienced before, right? It might not be the way you work with it every day. We do that intentionally. So if you do that more of that before, the more successful you'll be. So just set aside time for yourself, whether it be after this training or sometime later this week, and just use these 3 tools and just play with them in different ways. Go to that join tool and click through all of those options. Discover each of these things, what they do, why you might use them, so on and so forth. Look them up in the help menu. If you want to find out more, you can click on these tools and hit this question mark, right? And this will bring up a whole kind of manual of what's going on here and what options you have. So there's a lot going on there, but if you know these deeply, you'll be successful with blending inside of that exam. But in addition to that, it'll really up your skills on game day, or actually not on game day, but just on your day-to-day job. So I do see chat coming in here. Let me open that. Yeah, so someone said that, you know, they took the exam yesterday and they found it difficult because they're not super familiar with some of the tools, right? And that's one thing that I will point out is we purposely did not name this exam beginner, right? You'll see that there's an advanced and an expert, but we purposely didn't name this one the beginner exam. It's a tough exam, but we purposely named it core because it covers the core set of tools that you need to do or probably interface with on a daily basis. And it not only covers the breadth of those tools, but to an extreme depth, right? So little nuances, and that's why we actually make it an open book test, is so if there's a question that you're not sure about, you can test it, right? And for a lot of our exam, it's not necessarily just knowing the answer, it's knowing how to get to the answer quickly. And that's pretty much something that you'll experience in any software or in any coding language, is that it's not always about just having things memorized, it's just knowing the right resources to get to the answer quickly. Certainly if you have to go to the resources on every single question, you'll probably run out of time. But for the most part, you know, don't be afraid to fiddle around in the designer a little bit and have fun with it, whether it be in the weekly challenges or not. Any questions on those blending tools? I'm just going to introduce you to the support resources, and if any more come in, I'll just hang on a few minutes after and just see if any more come in, and then we'll be on our way. So the first of which is, I'm sure you've been there because you wouldn't have been at this training today, but just check out the Alteryx community. You'll find a lot of answers. Remember I told you going to the right place quickly? This is one of the things that you should have in your pocket, this Alteryx community, and really know how to work with the community. I like to tell people that it's a product, right? It's not just another support forum. If you can work the community and bend it to your will, it'll be a very powerful resource. So I'll tease something and say, have you ever done an advanced search inside of Alteryx community, or sorry, the community? If not, I would look at that you'll notice, let's see if I can pull it up here. Right? I could search each of these things. I could select a category, what the board is. I could go to an advanced search, right, and select some sort of modifiers. Location, label, author, metadata, type of post. So there's a lot of ways that you can kind of filter and sort all your way through. If you can use this to your advantage, you'll be successful on game day. Second of which is continue to use the Alteryx Academy. I will say that while these trainings are meant to get you to score certification, they will not be enough in themselves. Really, I'm introducing the topics at their most base level, but what you'll have to use this as a jump-off point to continue to dig a little deeper, in this case, with blending tools. Last week, we talked about input and output and data types. If you're still not confident in those, look in Alteryx Academy and learn more and really dive into the depth of those. And then finally, if you have any issues, whether it be Alteryx Designer and you just can't figure something out, go ahead and email us at support@alteryx.com and we'll connect you with someone who can help. My first recommendation would always be going to the community. You'll find that that's probably the snappiest way of getting your answer, but if it's something that's like a tool issue that you didn't expect or some behavior that you're not expecting, go ahead and hit support. That's all I've got, folks. Again, my name is Joe Miller. You can find me on the community at the handle Joe M. I really appreciate you joining today. If you are interested in joining part 3, we will be coming back in the first week of November to run that. Aside from that, I'm just going to hang on the line for a few more minutes and answer any questions. If not, we'll see you in November. So there is a question coming in. How many times can you try the exam in a month? The answer is 3 times. This exam is free for the user, but we do pay on your behalf to host you in that exam. And to keep costs reasonable and make sure that people aren't overtaking those tests, we reserve 3 attempts per month. If you don't pass in those 3 attempts, you could sign up for the following month and so on and so forth. But essentially at the end of the day, the reason that we wait a month is it allows us to kind of forecast the cost of what it's going to be to host that exam on your behalf. The question is, hey Joe, would there be any session for advanced exam or partnership exam? Yeah, so I think we're going to get through this this particular core series and then go into an advanced series. And advanced gets a little tougher in the sense that we continue to work with the core set of tools, but we continually expand the breadth of those exams. At a high level, if you want to be very good with those advanced exams, I think there's a couple different things that I would test or really review strongly. The first of which would be reporting. Go and look at any reporting trainings on live training. In addition to that, I would look at spatial trainings. And then finally, macro trainings and applications. If you know those 4 things, then you're going to be successful in an advanced exam. But macros is probably the hardest part for many people, and probably reporting too. Actually, so if you go to live training and look it up, there's a series called Build Your First Macro. There's actually 3 types of macros. There's one training just on building standard, there's one on batch, and there's one on iterative. And not only will that help you with the exam, but you'll just unlock a whole another level of usage in Designer that you've never had before if you can understand how to work those. Reporting can be a little bit tough if you don't understand it. I would go and visit that training. And spatial, I think a lot of people at the very base level can get, but again, we dive into some deep configuration, so I'd review some of the spatial courses on live training. And we also have a spatial course on the interactive lessons page I would review.